The Galactic Cooperative had spent nearly 7,000 years perfecting its species classification system. 7,000 years of debates. 7,000 years of scientific studies. 7,000 years of politicians arguing over terminology, while researchers quietly begged for stronger safety regulations. In the end, all that effort produced a surprisingly simple conclusion. How difficult is this species to accidentally kill? Officially, the system was described as a comprehensive biological and environmental risk assessment framework. Unofficially, it was a galaxy-wide ranking of who could survive the dumbest mistakes. It wasn't the most diplomatic approach, but diplomacy had suffered a fatal setback during the infamous crystalline delegation incident. A visiting ambassador named Quelix had extended a ceremonial greeting appendage. The receiving delegate, attempting to be friendly, responded with what humans would later classify as a moderately enthusiastic handshake. The result was 17 separate pieces of Ambassador Quelix spread across a conference room floor. After that, practicality won the argument. The classification system became mandatory. Every known species received a rating. Low-risk species were delicate creatures that required special accommodations, protective equipment, and detailed warnings attached to virtually every public object. High-risk species were the opposite. They could survive environmental disasters, industrial accidents, military mishaps, and in one memorable case, an unauthorized encounter with a fusion reactor. The system was elegant, efficient, almost impossible to dispute. At least, that's what everyone believed. Then humanity submitted their biological data, and the entire classification committee spent the next 3 weeks arguing over whether the results were a software error, a statistical anomaly, or evidence that Earth itself was actively trying to kill its inhabitants. Class 1 species hailed from garden worlds, where evolution had been less of a brutal gladiatorial arena and more of a gentle suggestion. These beings required specific atmospheric compositions, precise temperature ranges, and absolutely no sudden movements. Class 2 species were marginally hardier, capable of surviving minor fluctuations in their environment without immediately expiring. The classifications continued upward, each tier representing species who had evolved in progressively more hostile conditions. Then there were the Deathworlders. Class 9 and Class 10 species came from planets that seemed to actively hate life, where survival was less of a given and more of a daily miracle. These worlds featured extreme gravity, violent weather patterns, aggressive megapa, and ecosystems that operated on the principle that everything wanted to kill everything else. Naturally, the Galactic Cooperative kept a very careful distance from Deathworlders, who were regarded with the same mixture of awe and terror that one might reserve for a active volcano wearing a smile. Earth had been classified as a Class 10 Deathworld within approximately 47 minutes of first contact. The human delegation had seemed confused by this designation, which should have been the first warning sign. Any species that did not immediately understand why their homeworld was considered a cosmic horror show was clearly suffering from severe psychological damage. The humans had politely inquired about the classification criteria, listened to the exhaustive list of their planet's nightmarish qualities, and then responded with something that roughly translated to, "Huh, yeah, I guess it does rain a lot." This response had required 3 weeks of xenopsychological counseling for the evaluation committee. Despite Earth's terrifying classification, humans had been provisionally accepted into the Galactic Cooperative with one critical stipulation: limited interaction with Class 1 through Class 5 species until proper safety protocols could be established. It was the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "Yes, you can join our club, but please stay in that corner and try not to breathe too loudly," which made the Galactic Youth Exchange Program's decision to accept a human student at Voltron Academy either remarkably progressive or catastrophically stupid, depending on who you asked. Voltron Academy occupied a massive station in neutral space, a gleaming construct of silver and crystalline architecture that housed approximately 12,000 students from 73 different species. It was considered the pinnacle of civilized education, where the galaxy's brightest young minds gathered to learn advanced sciences, cultural diplomacy, and the art of not accidentally killing each other through biological incompatibility. The station maintained a carefully controlled environment, calibrated for Class 1 through Class 4 species. The atmosphere was a precise mixture of gases, the temperature held at a comfortable 22 degrees standard, and the gravity maintained at a gentle 0.7 standard G. Everything was soft edges and muted colors. Designed for species whose evolutionary history had not included concepts like predation or survival of the fittest into this delicate ecosystem, they had invited a human. The girl arrived on a Tuesday, which would later be remembered as either cosmically ironic or prophetically appropriate. She came through the docking bay with minimal luggage, wearing what the intake coordinator's database identified as a school uniform from her homeworld: a dark blazer, a pleated skirt, knee-high socks, and a small backpack decorated with colorful pins. She looked, by all available evidence, utterly harmless. This was the galaxy's first mistake. Intake coordinator Gallisk, a centurion whose species resembled what humans might describe as a floating jellyfish made of lavender smoke, processed the human's arrival with professional efficiency, tinged with barely concealed nervousness. The human had smiled during the intake process, which had exposed her teeth, bone-white calcium structures designed for tearing and grinding, and Jellisk had required a moment to compose himself. "Welcome to Valoran Academy," Jellisk had said, his vocoder translating his chemical emissions into comprehensible language. "Your species designation has been noted, and we have prepared appropriate accommodations. Please be aware that your physical capabilities may exceed those of your fellow students, and we ask that you exercise appropriate restraint." The human had nodded, with what appeared to be genuine understanding, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had argued. "Of course," she had said, "I will be super careful, I promise." The use of the word super had not been reassuring. The girl had been assigned to Residential Wing 7, a section populated primarily by Class 2 and Class 3 species, who were deemed sturdy enough to handle proximity to someone from a more robust evolutionary background. Her roommate was a planarian, named Vixori, whose species resembled a collection of floating geometric shapes, held together by some force that physics could not adequately explain. Vori had prepared extensively for the human's arrival, reading every available file on Earth and its inhabitants. She considered herself intellectually ready for the experience. She was, it would turn out, catastrophically wrong. The first incident occurred within 6 hours. Vori had watched with increasing concern as the human unpacked her belongings, which included several items that appeared designed for survival scenarios that should never occur in civilized space. A compressed sleeping bag rated for Mycian 40 degrees, a multi-tool that included no fewer than 17 different blades, a container of something labeled emergency rations that, according to the translator, could sustain a human for up to 5 days in hostile territory. "Do you expect hostile territory at an educational institution?" Vixori had asked her geometric components, rearranging themselves into a pattern that indicated polite confusion. The human had laughed, which was a sound that Victoria's species found deeply unsettling on a biological level. "Oh no, these are just normal things I brought from home. You know, just in case." "Just in case of what specifically?" "I don't know. Anything." I guess this answer had not provided the comfort Vixori was seeking. The human had then proceeded to perform what she called her evening routine, which involved a series of physical exercises that defied Vori's understanding of biology. The girl dropped to the floor and executed 30 repetitions of an exercise called push-ups, which required her to lift her entire body weight using only her arms. She followed this with something called sit-ups, then squats, then a stretching routine that suggested her skeletal structure was held together by rubber instead of proper bone. "Is this necessary for your health?" Vori had asked, watching with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Not really," the human had replied, slightly out of breath. "I just like to stay in shape. Plus, I am on the track team back home, so I need to keep up my training." The concept of voluntarily engaging in physical exertion beyond what was strictly necessary for survival was so alien to Vixori that she required several minutes to process it. The human had then consumed approximately 1 liter of water in a single continuous gulp, smiled brightly, and announced she was going to take a shower with the water temperature set to as hot as possible. Vori had immediately filed a wellness check with the residential advisor. By the end of the first week, the human had become something of a legend among the student body, though not in the way the exchange program coordinators had hoped. Stories circulated through the residential wings, each more alarming than the last, and all of them completely true. In Professor Kelman's introduction to organic chemistry class, the human had accidentally knocked over a beaker containing a solution of diluted hydrochloric acid. While the other students had evacuated in accordance with safety protocols, the human had simply grabbed the nearest absorption cloth and cleaned up the spill with her bare hands. When Professor Kelman, a gaseous being who existed primarily as a sentient cloud, had frantically informed her that the acid could cause severe burns. The human had examined her hands with mild curiosity. "Oh yeah, my skin is a little red," she had observed. "I should probably wash this off, huh?" The concentration that would have permanently scarred most Class 1 through Class 4 species had caused her minor dermatological irritation. Professor Kelman had canceled the rest of that day's classes to reevaluate his career choices. Physical education had been similarly catastrophic. The class was designed for species whose idea of exercise involved gentle floating or perhaps some light hovering. The human had arrived in specialized clothing, called athletic wear, and had proceeded to treat the low-gravity gymnasium like her personal training facility. When the instructor, a Delphinian named Chorus, had suggested they begin with a light warm-up jog, the human had nodded agreeably and started running. Except her version of running involved moving at speeds that most species reserved for emergency evacuations. She had circled the gymnasium 17 times in the span of 3 minutes, her feet striking the padded floor with rhythmic impacts that sounded like a percussion instrument designed to intimidate prey. Chorus had watched with increasing alarm as the human's body did things that should not be possible for any oxygen-breathing organism. Her skin had changed color, shifting to a flushed pink as her internal temperature regulation system activated. She had begun secreting liquid through her skin, a waste elimination system that operated continuously during physical exertion. Her respiratory rate had increased, pulling in huge volumes of the station's carefully calibrated atmosphere, and she had smiled the entire time as if this was enjoyable. "Is the pace too slow?" she had asked when she finally stopped, barely winded. "I can go faster if you want." Chorus had needed to sit down, which was particularly notable given that his species did not technically have the ability to sit. The cafeteria incidents had become the stuff of station-wide legend. The human's dietary requirements were, to put it mildly, disturbing. She was an omnivore, which meant she could consume both plant and animal matter. Already a red flag for species who had evolved past such barbaric practices. But the specifics of what she ate had caused several students to question the fundamental fairness of evolution. On her third day, she had casually mentioned that her favorite food was something called pizza, which apparently involved taking grain products, coating them with liquefied dairy proteins, adding processed plant matter, and then, this was the part that had caused residential advisor Flume to require medical attention, topping the entire construction with preserved meat from an earth creature called a pig. "You consume the flesh of other organisms?" a crystalline student had asked, her prismatic structure flickering with distress. "Well, yeah," the human had replied, apparently confused by the question. "Humans are apex predators. We eat pretty much everything." The phrase apex predator had entered the station's rumor mill with the force of a small explosive device. But it was the human's casual relationship with danger that truly set her apart from her fellow students. Things that would send Class 1 species into panic attacks barely registered on her threat assessment scale. When a minor power fluctuation had caused the lights in Corridor 9 to flicker, the human had simply pulled out a small cylindrical device from her pocket that produced its own light. She had called it a flashlight and explained that she always carried one just in case. The concept of being prepared for infrastructure failure as a matter of routine had been genuinely incomprehensible to species whose stations had not experienced a power failure in 600 years. When a fellow student had discovered what he believed was a dangerous creature in the common area, later identified as a completely harmless cleaning drone that had malfunctioned, the human had calmly approached it, diagnosed the problem, and fixed it using her multi-tool. She had then picked up the drone, which weighed approximately 15 kilograms, with one hand, and returned it to the maintenance closet. It just needed a reboot, she had explained to the dozen students who had evacuated to a safe distance. No big deal. The casual application of problem-solving skills and physical capability had been extremely big deal. By the second week, the human had acquired an entourage of students who followed her around with the dedication of religious pilgrims. Though their motivations ranged from scientific curiosity to the kind of morbid fascination one might have watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion, they cataloged her behaviors, recorded her statements, and tried desperately to understand the psychology of a species that had evolved to find their nightmare homeworld perfectly acceptable. Professor Thiene, who taught comparative xenobiology, had made the human the subject of an entire lecture series. With the girl's permission, he had conducted a comprehensive biological scan, and the results had required him to update approximately 40% of his course materials. The human skeletal structure was reinforced with a mineral compound that made it approximately 3 times denser than comparable Class 1 species. Her muscular system operated on a ratio of strength to mass that seemed to violate several principles of evolutionary efficiency. Her cardiovascular system could increase its performance by up to 300% during stress responses, flooding her tissues with oxygenated blood and triggering a cascade of chemical reactions that temporarily enhanced her physical capabilities even further. Her immune system was a military-industrial complex operating inside her body, capable of identifying, targeting, and destroying thousands of different pathogens. She possessed redundant organs, a distributed nervous system that could continue functioning even if parts of it were damaged, and a pain tolerance that Professor Thrin described as clinically concerning. "Your species evolved to survive everything," Professor Threody had said during one of their conversations, his chitinous exterior clicking with agitation. "Your bodies are designed for a world that is actively trying to kill you at all times." The human had considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "I mean, Earth is not that bad. Sure, we have hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, droughts, floods, wildfires, and like a bunch of animals that can kill you, but you learn to deal with it. It is just home, you know." Professor Thinity had not known, and had spent the rest of the day questioning his understanding of the word home. The turning point came during the 3rd week, when Station Director Valerix called an emergency assembly to discuss a developing situation. A solar flare from the nearby star was going to impact the station's shields, potentially causing fluctuations in the environmental systems. It was a minor issue, the sort of thing that happened once every few years, and the station systems were designed to compensate automatically. There may be some temporary variations in temperature and atmospheric composition. Director Valerix announced her scaled crest flattening with concern. "We recommend all students remain in their quarters until the event passes. It should last no more than 6 hours." The student body had received this news with appropriate levels of anxiety. Temperature variations could be dangerous for species with narrow environmental tolerances. Atmospheric changes could cause respiratory distress. 6 hours was a long time to endure potentially uncomfortable conditions. The human had raised her hand. "Yes," Director Valerix had said, recognizing her with some trepidation. "What is the expected temperature range?" Director Valerix consulted her datapad. "We anticipate fluctuations between 18 and 28 degrees standard. Additionally, oxygen levels may vary between 19 and 23%, and humidity could increase by up to 15%. The human had nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, so basically a normal spring day on Earth. Got it." The assembly hall had gone completely silent. "I am sorry," Director Valerix had said carefully. "Did you say a normal spring day?" "Yeah, those are pretty standard conditions where I am from. Actually, it is a lot more stable than most days back home. At least you know what is coming and can prepare for it." The implication that Earth's normal, unpredictable weather was worse than what the station considered an emergency had required several minutes of stunned silence to process. When the solar flare hit, the station systems performed exactly as predicted. The temperature climbed to 27 degrees in some sections, dropped to 18 in others. The atmospheric processors struggled to maintain consistent oxygen levels. Humidity spiked, causing condensation on some of the cooler surfaces. For most of the student body, it was a miserable 6 hours spent in their quarters, managing mild discomfort and complaining to each other through the station's communication network. The human had gone for a jog. Vixori had watched in disbelief as her roommate laced up her running shoes, a concept that still baffled her as most species did not require specialized equipment for the basic act of locomotion, and announced she was going to take advantage of the humidity to get some good cardio in. "The environmental conditions are outside safe parameters," Vixori had protested weakly. "For you maybe," the human had replied cheerfully. "For me, this is great training weather. Back home, I used to run in way worse conditions. One time, I did a 5-kilometer race in the rain when it was like 12 degrees. This is basically perfect." She had left the room at a light jog, her footfalls echoing down the corridor with metronomic precision. Within 20 minutes, reports had started flooding into the station's emergency response network. A human student was running through the corridors. She appeared to be exercising voluntarily. She was sweating profusely, but seemed to be enjoying herself. She had smiled and waved at several students who had peered out of their quarters with mounting alarm. Director Valerix had personally intercepted the human and Corridor 12, materializing in her path with what she hoped was authoritative presence. "Student," she had said firmly, "you should be in your quarters. The environmental conditions are not stable. The human had stopped jogging, though she continued bouncing slightly on her feet, in a way that suggested her body was not ready to cease physical activity. "Oh hey, Director Valorix. Sorry, I did not realize I was not supposed to be out here. I thought the recommendation was just for people who were uncomfortable with the conditions." "You are not uncomfortable." "Not really. I mean, it is a little warm, but nothing too bad. Kind of reminds me of summer back home." Director Valorix had stared at this small being, this child really, who was standing in environmental conditions that were causing most of her students genuine distress, and had an epiphany that was equal parts revelation and existential horror. Humans did not have a safety range. They had a preference range, certainly a zone of optimal comfort, but their actual survival parameters were so broad that what other species considered dangerous was to them merely inconvenient. "Tell me," Director Valorix had said slowly, "what environmental conditions would you consider dangerous?" The human had thought about this with an expression of genuine concentration. "I mean, if it gets below freezing, or above, like 40 degrees, that starts to get pretty uncomfortable. And if the oxygen drops below 15%, or goes above 25%, that would be a problem. Oh, and if the humidity gets above 90%, or drops below 10%, that can cause some issues." Director Valorix had calculated those parameters against her own species' survival range. The human's acceptable conditions covered a span that included 5 different climate classifications and would be immediately lethal to approximately 60% of the station's population. "I see," she had said faintly. "Please return to your quarters anyway for my peace of mind if nothing else." The human had agreed with good-natured compliance, though she had mentioned something about finishing her cooldown that suggested she did not entirely understand the concept of immediate compliance. That evening, Director Valorix had done something she had not done in her 30 years of station administration. She had accessed Earth's environmental database and actually read the detailed specifications. Earth's atmosphere was 21% oxygen, which would cause hyperoxia and potential cellular damage in most Class 1 species. Its gravity was 1.0 standard G, which would crush the skeletal structures of anyone not evolved for such conditions. Its temperature ranges varied wildly depending on location and season, from -40 degrees in some regions to +50 degrees in others. The planet was 70% covered in a liquid that most species considered a universal solvent and would require specialized equipment to survive in. The remaining 30% featured every possible terrain type, from frozen wastelands to arid deserts to dense jungles, filled with organisms that competed for resources with ultra-violent efficiency. Earth experienced regular catastrophic weather events, hurricanes with wind speeds exceeding 300 km/h, tornadoes that could level entire settlements, electrical storms that discharge billions of joules of energy, and temperature fluctuations that could span 30 degrees in a single day. And humans just lived there. They built their homes and raised their children, and went about their daily lives on a planet that was actively hostile to biological existence. Director Valorix had closed the database and sat in silence for approximately 20 minutes, contemplating the implications. The next day, she had called an assembly specifically for the teaching staff. "We need to discuss the human student." She had begun without preamble. "Has she done something wrong?" Professor Kelman had asked. His gaseous form flickering with concern. "No, that is precisely the problem. She has done everything right according to human standards, which means she has been casually demonstrating capabilities that make most of our students question the fundamental fairness of evolution." Professor Throd had clicked his mandibles in agreement. "I have been conducting ongoing observations. The human female operates at what she describes as normal capacity within her species' baseline parameters. She has not yet demonstrated any of the enhanced capabilities that humans are capable of during stress responses." "Enhanced capabilities?" another professor had asked weakly. "Under duress, humans can access something they call adrenaline responses. Professor Threnaud had explained their strength can increase by up to 40%. Their pain perception decreases, their reaction times improve, and they enter a state of heightened awareness that prioritizes survival over virtually all other considerations. There are documented cases of humans lifting objects several times their body weight, running at speeds that should tear their muscles, and continuing to function despite injuries that would be immediately fatal to most species. The staff had absorbed this information with the enthusiasm of people being told their retirement savings had been invested in a black hole. "So what you are telling us," Director Valorix had said slowly, "is that the human we have on this station, who has already demonstrated alarming capabilities, is currently operating at her casual baseline and could theoretically become significantly more formidable if she perceived a threat. Correct. Director Valorix had made a decision that would later be studied in xeno-diplomatic courses as either brilliant or insane. Then we need to ensure she never perceives a threat while on this station. More importantly, we need to stop treating her like she is fragile and start recognizing that she is probably the most capable organism on this entire facility. The staff had spent the next hour discussing how to implement this philosophical shift, while simultaneously dealing with the psychological impact of realizing that their safety protocols were designed for protecting students from the environment, when they should have been considering how to protect the environment from the student. The human, blissfully unaware of these administrative discussions, continued her daily routine with the same cheerful obliviousness that had characterized her time on the station. She attended her classes, completed her assignments, exercised religiously, and maintained her social connections with a genuine warmth that made it difficult to remember she was a walking biological weapon system. Her fellow students had gradually adjusted to her presence, moving from terror to fascination to a kind of resigned acceptance. The human was strange, yes, and her capabilities were unsettling certainly, but she was also unfailingly kind, remarkably patient with questions about her species, and possessed a sense of humor that translated surprisingly well across species barriers. During a study session in the common area, a Centurion student named Flessick had finally asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Does it not bother you," he had said carefully, "that your homeworld is so dangerous that your species had to evolve so many survival mechanisms just to exist?" The human had looked up from her datapad, considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness, and then smiled. "I guess I never really thought about it that way. I mean, yeah, Earth can be dangerous, but it is also beautiful. We have these things called sunsets, where the light from our star hits the atmosphere at an angle and creates all these colors across the sky. We have oceans that are so vast you cannot see the other side, and mountains that take days to climb, and forests that have been growing for thousands of years." She had paused, her expression growing distant with memory, and yeah, sometimes there are hurricanes or earthquakes or whatever, but that is just part of living on a planet that is alive. You know, everything on Earth is connected. The weather, the animals, the plants, the geology. It all fits together into this big, complicated, beautiful system. But surely you wish it was safer, another student had asked. The human had laughed. I mean, safer would be nice, I guess. But if Earth was safer, we would not be who we are. Humans are adaptable because we had to be. We are strong because our environment demanded it. We are creative because we had to find solutions to impossible problems. Our entire history is basically just a story of refusing to let our planet kill us, and eventually figuring out how to thrive. Anyway, she had shrugged, returning to her datapad. Besides, I kind of like knowing that I come from a place that made me tough. It is something to be proud of, you know. The study group had sat in silence, processing this perspective. To come from a world that was actively hostile, and to feel pride rather than resentment, was so fundamentally alien to their experience that it required a complete recontextualization of their understanding of survival. Later that week, a minor incident had occurred that cemented the human's reputation on the station forever. A maintenance drone had malfunctioned in one of the storage bays, creating a small electrical fire. The automated suppression systems had engaged immediately, but a section of storage racks had partially collapsed, trapping 2 students, a Delphinian and a Crystalline, behind a barrier of fallen equipment. The station's emergency response team had been alerted, but they were delayed by a training exercise in another section of the facility. Estimated response time was 8 minutes. The human had been passing by when she heard the distress calls. What happened next would be reviewed by the station's security systems approximately 400 times in the following week, each viewing generating more questions than answers. The human had assessed the situation with a speed that suggested her threat evaluation systems operated at a fundamentally different processing rate than most species. She had noted the fire already being suppressed by automated systems, the fallen equipment, the trapped students, and the lack of immediate response personnel. Then she had simply walked into the storage bay and started moving the equipment. The fallen storage racks were modular units, each weighing approximately 80 kilograms, and designed to be moved only with mechanical assistance. The human had grabbed the first rack, her muscles visibly tensing beneath her skin, and lifted it enough to shift it aside, then the second, then the third. By the time the emergency response team arrived, she had cleared a path to the trapped students and was helping them out of the debris field, asking them if they were injured with the calm efficiency of someone conducting a routine safety check. The response team's leader, a Tharvian named Kixis, whose species resembled an ambulatory plant system, had stared at the scene with disbelief. "Did you move all of this yourself?" he had asked. The human had looked at the displaced equipment, as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh yeah. It was not that heavy, and the students needed help. Was I not supposed to do that? Each of those racks weighs 80 kilograms. Yeah, I could tell. I used to help my dad move furniture back home, so I know how to lift properly. You just need to bend your knees and use your core strength." The concept of furniture moving as a casual domestic activity that required moving objects weighing 80 kilograms had caused Klexis to reevaluate several assumptions about civilized living. News of the incident had spread through the student body with the speed of light traveling through a vacuum. The human had moved equipment that should have required mechanical assistance. She had done it calmly, efficiently, and without apparent strain. She had put herself at potential risk to help others. She was, in short, exactly the kind of person the Galactic Cooperative had been trying to cultivate for 7,000 years. Except she came from a Deathworld, and apparently considered all of this completely normal behavior. Director Valerix had called the human to her office the next day, ostensibly to discuss the incident. In reality, she wanted to understand what motivated a being who could casually perform feats of strength to risk herself for others. "Why did you enter the storage bay?" Director Valerix had asked. "You could have waited for the emergency response team." The human had seemed genuinely confused by the question. "Because waiting would have taken 8 minutes, and I was right there. It seemed like the obvious choice. You did not consider the potential danger. I mean, the fire was already being put out, and the equipment was not that unstable. It was just heavy, and someone needed help. That is all. Someone needed help, so you helped them." The human had nodded. "Yeah, pretty much. That is kind of a basic thing where I come from. If you can help and you do not, that is considered really bad." Director Valerix had studied this young being, this product of a nightmare world who had been shaped by brutality, into something unexpectedly noble, and had finally understood what made humans truly dangerous. It was not their strength, though they were undeniably strong. It was not their resilience, though they could survive conditions that would kill most species. It was not even their adaptability, though they could thrive in environments ranging from Arctic tundra to desert wastelands. It was their baseline assumption that helping others was the default choice. That risking yourself for someone else was not heroism, but basic decency. That cooperation was not a political strategy, but a fundamental moral obligation. Humans had evolved on a world that tried to kill them constantly, and their response had been to build societies based on mutual aid and collective survival. They had looked at a planet full of hazards and decided that the biggest threat was not the environment, but the possibility of facing it alone. "You are a remarkable individual," Director Weiler had said. Finally, the human had blushed, her skin shifting to a darker shade in what appeared to be an embarrassment response. "I really just did what anyone would do." "No," Director Valorix had corrected gently. "You did what any human would do. That is what makes you remarkable." The remainder of the academic term had proceeded with a new understanding permeating the station's social dynamics. The human was no longer viewed as a dangerous anomaly, but as a representative of a species whose capabilities were matched by their compassion. Students who had initially avoided her began seeking her out, asking questions about Earth, about human culture, about what it meant to come from a place where survival required constant vigilance and cooperation. The human had answered every question with patience and humor, describing her home world with the affection of someone talking about a difficult but beloved family member. She told stories about Earth's seasons, its diverse ecosystems, its staggering variety of life forms. She explained human customs, human history, human art and music and literature. And gradually, the students of Valoran Academy began to understand that Deathworlds did not just produce survivors. They produced survivors who valued life precisely because they understood how fragile and precious it was. On the last day of the term, Professor Thrinodi had given a final lecture on comparative xenobiology that had deviated significantly from the approved curriculum. "We began this course," he had said, "with the assumption that classification systems define species, that Class 1 organisms are fundamentally different from Class 10 organisms, not just in capability, but in nature." He had paused, his chitinous exterior clicking thoughtfully. This was incorrect. The lecture hall had erupted in confused murmurs. The human student among us, Professor Threnody had continued, has demonstrated that classification describes environmental adaptation, not moral character. Her species evolved to survive a hostile world. Yes, they developed remarkable physical capabilities certainly, but they also developed societies built on cooperation, art that celebrates beauty, and philosophies that value kindness. He had looked directly at the human who was sitting in her usual seat near the front, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. You have taught us that strength without compassion is merely survival, but compassion born from strength is civilization. The human had raised her hand tentatively. I just want to say that I am really not that special. Most humans are way more capable than me. I am literally just a student who runs track and likes pizza. The fact that she genuinely believed this, that she could not see how extraordinary she was by galactic standards, had somehow made Professor Threnod's point even more effectively than any argument he could have made. As the term ended, and students departed for their respective homeworlds, the human had said her goodbyes with the same cheerful optimism she had displayed upon arrival. She had hugged students whose biology made such physical contact mildly terrifying, promised to stay in touch via the Galactic Communication Network, and expressed genuine excitement about returning to Earth. I have missed the weather, she had said to Victory during their final conversation as roommates. I know that sounds weird, but there is something about rain that just feels like home, you know? Vori, who had spent months studying her roommate with the dedication of a scientist, observing a new phenomenon, had finally understood. You missed the chaos because the chaos shaped you. The human had grinned. Yeah, exactly. You get it. As the transport ship carrying the human student departed from the station, Director Valorix had stood in the observation deck, watching it disappear into the distance. Beside her, Professor Threnody maintained his usual contemplative posture. Do you think she knows? The professor had asked, how much she changed this place. I doubt it, Director Valorix had replied. Humans rarely recognize their own impact. It is one of their more endearing qualities, and also one of their most dangerous. True, they had stood in silence, considering the implications of a species that could reshape perspectives simply by being themselves. The Galactic Cooperative had spent 7,000 years building elaborate classification systems, creating safety protocols and maintaining careful boundaries between species of different durability classes. And a single human student, just by showing up and being helpful, had demonstrated that perhaps they had been measuring the wrong things all along. The reports from Valoran Academy would eventually reach the higher councils of the Galactic Cooperative, sparking debates about human integration, safety protocols, and the philosophical implications of Deathworld species in civilized society. Committees would form, recommendations would be drafted, and policies would be revised. But none of that mattered to the human girl on the transport ship heading back to Earth. She was probably already planning her next track season, thinking about what food she would eat when she got home, and looking forward to telling her friends about her semester in space. She would describe the experience as pretty cool and really interesting, and her friends would nod and ask if the food was any good, and she would laugh and say, not really, but I survived. And none of them would understand how that single sentence, I survived, contained within it the entire philosophy of a species that had looked at an impossible world and decided to thrive anyway. Somewhere on Valoran Academy, a Class 1 student would look up at the stars and think about the human who had moved 80-kilogram equipment like it was furniture, who had jogged during an environmental emergency like it was a pleasant spring day, who had smiled with her predator teeth and been kind anyway. And they would wonder, with the kind of existential uncertainty that comes from having your worldview fundamentally altered, what else they had gotten wrong about the galaxy. The answer, of course, was everything, but that was okay. Humans had been getting things wrong for their entire evolutionary history, and it had never stopped them from figuring it out eventually. That, more than anything else, was what made them truly dangerous. Not that they were strong, but that they never stopped trying to be